Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, I have a question for me This time, not one time, I don't know what that was. Should I start over? Nah, we'll just keep going. I have a question for me, which is why am I doing this? And I know that's kind of the first question you get in kind of like a philosophy 101 course of why do anything, which is arguably one of the most obnoxious statements ever uttered by any human being anywhere. It's also really obnoxious when you ask somebody, well, why did you do that? And they respond with, why does anyone do anything? You, okay? Anyway, this was supposed to be an actual moment of real introspection. Why am I doing this right here? And what is this right here? This is me staring at the camera of my iPhone on a tripod, flanked usually by some interesting comic book that I'm reading or that I think is kind of visually interesting for you to look at. And then just holding up a book, which of course today we're continuing with Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And the question becomes, well, why am I doing this? There's nothing stopping you, the viewer, from sitting down and reading this graphic novel for yourself. Arguably, your experience of it is going to mean far, far, far more than my experience or my commentary on this. But here's the thing, there's almost an entire industry of people on YouTube making a living or just basically making a regular hobby of sitting in front of a camera, talking ad nauseum about something, telling you, hey, you should read this, hey, you shouldn't read this, publishing it online, and hashtag content, there you go. But that doesn't really answer why you do it, especially when it comes to books, because it's such a personal experience. Your reading of a book is going to be entirely different than mine, and especially with a meta comic like Understanding Comics, there's so much to experience, sometimes in just one single panel. But then I suppose I also have to take maybe a macro approach to this, which is, why am I doing these videos, period? Now, this question I may not necessarily answer right away, and in fact I may come up with a million different answers before the end of this video. But I promise this video is not going to just be me talking, again, ad nauseum into the camera, explaining my motivations for making these videos. Like I say over and over again, I love comics. I always have. They're what my mom literally taught me to read with, and since that time, I have just inhaled just about every single comic I could get my hands on, regardless of content. For me, it's not just about enjoying a story, it's about really appreciating how comics can work as a medium, and you really can't get a better example of it than Understanding Comics. Now let's come back full circle and look at what we're talking about today, which of course is Chapter 7, The 6 Steps. Now, McCloud really, in this chapter, moves... I mentioned the word meta a moment ago. If you don't know what meta is, it's kind of more or less something about something. So a fancy pants word is metacognition. Metacognition is thinking about thinking. So thinking about the way you think. If you... do meta comics. It's comics about comics. Metafiction is fiction about fiction. And you can do this for just about absolutely anything. Just about every format of media, cultural analysis, what have you, has employed something like this at some point or other. But this book is really unique in the fact that it was one of the first efforts to really sit down and use the comic medium to examine and then at the same time validate the medium of comics as a respectable medium. And in fact, one of the points of this book, he notes, comics is just one of many forms of self-expression and communication available to us. So far, we've mostly dealt with unique properties of comics, but there are properties that comics share with all other art forms. Though it seems innocuous enough now, there was a time when such a simple idea was ridiculed. Even today, there are those who ask the question, can comics be art? To which he answers, it is, I'm sorry, a really stupid question. Hopefully, one of the reasons I'm doing this is to convince you, the viewer, whoever you are, wherever you are, that to believe that right there. There are still people, even to this day, who, despite the fact you can shove in their face the fact that Art Spiegelman won a Pulitzer for his graphic novel Mouse, despite the fact that graphic novels are one of the cornerstone of our economic... and despite the fact that kids everywhere are hopping into comics and appreciating reading and enjoying reading because of graphic novels, And, Lord, the Avengers movie made billions of dollars, and the original source material was comics. There's no reason to argue anymore that comics isn't art of some kind. But that begs the question of, what's art? That is another obnoxious question, but one of the really fun things about this book, because Scott McCloud observes that the way we define art is really important. Now, I'm going to hold this page up to the camera, I'm going to pause it, and I'm going to let you read it. And make absolutely sure you do your best to read both pages. Alright, I'll pause it, I'll wait. You back? Okay. Hopefully the line of art made you fall out of your chair because you were laughing so hard. But it's not untrue. Again, for the purpose of this channel and the purpose of just analysis moving forward, we're going to understand art simply as self-expression that is not solely derived from the desire to reproduce or the desire to survive. And that can be really difficult because genres and media ultimately all rely on these two basic principles to basically give justification or motivation to the characters held within their art. If you think about most stories, it's usually a guy trying to get the girl, or in some instances, the girl trying to get the guy. That's reproduction. Trying to survive. How many action movies have you seen in your life or have heard people talk about them? A lot of art is really boiled down to those two motivations that are at the root of our biology. But the fact that we have art about them sort of ties into the notion that, yes, we can survive, and yes, we can reproduce, but that isn't all that life has to offer. Or maybe another way of saying it is, it's not the only thing that we need to make our life about. Now, I realize I'm getting into a lot of different ideas and concepts, and it'll be really hard to sort of keep me tacked down to this, because I can yammer on forever, just ask my friends. But the key to Chapter 7 of Understanding Comics is McCloud's really trying to get the reader to observe that art, or at least the perception of what art is, tends to be radically skewed because of a lot of extenuating circumstances and outside factors. And it's because of the perspectives of what people think art is that it's so difficult to argue that comics are art in the first place. If we think of art, we think of culture, we think of sculptures, fancy paintings, Nobel Prize winning authors, usually by a white guy, of course. But nevertheless, we think of other mediums. Comics, because it has traditionally been a very commercial medium, because it's been very cheap, and because there hasn't been a lot of belief behind it as a means of expressing the self, it's been easy to just shove comics off to the side, or, again, treat it as something not terribly mature. But I'm with Scott McCloud here. This is bullshit. And hopefully, another reason why I'm doing these videos is to demonstrate that to you, which is that, one, the idea that comics isn't art is bullshit, but then also, two, we have a wide variety of options at our disposal for self-expression. Now, I'll move on to the next part, which is more or less the sort of 6 steps of art, as Scott McCloud puts it. Okay. So in the first part, we've already addressed that art, as we understand it, is just anything that is not simply the desire to reproduce or the desire to not die. So, with that very wide description, or just that very wide definition, the reader is able to understand that, okay, we have a lot of opportunities for self-expression. And maybe we should sort of define that for the reader and for the viewer. Not that it requires too much. Self-expression is just taking the ideas, the beliefs, the thoughts in your head and forming them into some kind of physical, concrete, tangible reality. This is one of the reasons why it's really important to remember that writing is a technology, and the fact that you are able to take your thoughts and ideas and using abstract symbols, turn them into words. Again, if I take a little note that I wrote to myself, something about validation, I'm able to take a thought inside of my head, convert it into some sort of physical reality, and boom. This, in essence, could potentially be art. Now, is this art that's going to rival Guernica by Picasso? Come on. Come on. No, it's not. But nevertheless, it's a manner of self-expression. So as we discuss self-expression, we have to remember again that in terms of our society, in terms of our culture, and in terms of our species, we're unique in the fact that we can imagine, and that contributes a great deal to the way we self-express. Now, Scott McCloud offers 6 steps for the artist, and this is his sort of visual metaphor for sort of breaking into the idea of why people create, period. Again, in case you didn't observe it, we have 1, idea and purpose, 2, form, 3, idiom, 4, structure, 5, craft, 6, surface. He then goes through and explains steps 1 through 2, through 3, through 4, through 5, and 6. I'll go over briefly. Idea and purpose, kind of self-explanatory. It's just sort of the emotions, philosophies, and idea. It's sort of the original notion of, hey, I want to express this. 2 is the form. And this is important for us because, again, will be book, chalk drawings, chair, song, sculpture, pot holder, comic book. Again, we have to remember Scott McCloud here is defining art very broadly. And so when we consider art, we have to consider all the different forms. You may be sad, and you want to express that sadness. You can express that through painting, through sculpture, through writing a sad poem that only 3 people will ever read. Also, it's not that good, and your rhyme scheme is kind of off, and really, you're using a crow in your imagery, like, okay, really? Really? Anyway, you have options. But we also have to consider the fact that a lot of people are used to certain forms and equating certain forms with higher art. If I can bring my man Alexander the Great back in here, some people would look at this and think this form is high art. But if I can also bring in my man the Doomslayer here for a moment, I can put him right next to Alexander the Great, and some people will look at him and think that this is high art. Or at least this is an interesting form of art, or a more relatable form of art. And what can sometimes happen in the idea of art is polarization can take place. Now this gets all into the issues of class, education, race theory, what have you. There's so many different aspects as to why some people will look at Alexander and think this is art, and some people will look at Doomslayer, think this is art, and each side will look at the other and go, really? But this is the hard part of art, because again, we live in a culture where certain art forms, such as painting, sculpture, novels, poetry, is considered high art, whereas forms like comics, quilting, crochet, these are considered more low forms of art. Now, I'm not going to sit down and further diagnose that or analyze that, but all I'm going to argue for here is that as long as you're making some type of art, it doesn't really matter what form you use. You just move to the form that appeals to you directly. And that's what I really like about this book, and particularly about this chapter, is the way he sits down and breaks this down for the reader. Now, moving forward, you have idioms, so this is just sort of like styles, gestures, subject matter, genre. So if you want to write a horror story, or if you want to write a romance story, you have a lot of forms at your disposal, but when you get into the idiom, it moves into what are going to be the specific content of your art. Number 4 is structure, sort of putting it all together, what to include, what to leave out, how to arrange, how to compose the work. You probably a really good example of this is probably putting furniture in your house. I have this desk right up against a corner. I do that because this is a really old house and there's only so many workable outlets in this room, so I had to make sure my desk was close to an electrical outlet. Other people live in fancier homes and they have a lot more options to them, but sometimes the way they arrange the furniture in their home says a lot about the way they express themselves. Likewise, in art. You can have a lot of ideas about whatever you're working on, but not everything is going to go into it because sometimes that might make it too long. or sometimes you need more because it's too short, or maybe it's not short enough. That's just getting into all the different ideas. Number 5 is just craft. So the skills that you're going into the art itself. How much time and dedication are you dedicating to it? Because craft is different from all manner of people. Some people will look at Quagmire here and think, you know what? That's about all that I really want to put into the art. Whereas, okay, this isn't really a real bust of Socrates. This is just a 3D print that my local library printed out for me. But the original one is made out of marble and is held in the Louvre in France. So, what is the difference between Socrates and Quagmire? An entirely different craft approach went into constructing him in terms of the wrinkles on his forehead, the folds of his beard, or just even the construction of his base. We have to consider the fact that craft played a key note in terms of the construction of that work of art. And then finally, surface includes production values, finishing, the aspects most apparent on the first superficial exposure to the work. And he has a really good visual metaphor here using the apple. Now, immediately, my generation will go, ogres are like onions. They have layers. So, I mean, I think he's Gen X, so he can be forgiven for not doing an onion here. But his apple metaphor works very effectively in the fact that he observes that a great number of artists, when they approach the field of comics, largely tend to focus on the surface. There's a lot of superficial art in the field of comics. Now, some of this just has to do with the fact that comics has typically been a very commercial medium. Again, you're dealing with superheroes, westerns, romance, horror stories. A lot of it was cheaply produced, and it was designed to just sell, and then most of the time very quickly be forgotten. Nobody really saw this as an art form on the same level as a sculpture by Michelangelo or a painting by Francis Bacon. Nevertheless, paradigms change, and people are approaching the medium of comics in new, different, and really fascinating ways. And so all he's trying to do with that apple metaphor is just really show the reader that at this moment it's not it's not as easy or just simple or surface as we've sort of been led to believe. The artist has a lot of options, and as we consider those options, the artist has to consider every single one of these steps. Now, what follows in the book is several examples of people, and he basically takes each step, showing how artists will begin, they will stumble, and then sometimes what will happen is they give up because they get to a particular step in these 6 steps and go, I think I'm out, or it's not really worth the effort. Or sometimes, as he observes, sometimes there are individuals who will go forward and reach a particular step and they find themselves comfortable with it. But then there are others who continue to push and push forward through these steps until eventually they get to the most important one, which is, why am I doing this? There's really not much more in this chapter. Because, again, principally, which is the whole principal part of Chapter 7, is to just tie into the notion that comics is an art form. And since it's an art form, it's a culmination of several mental steps, processes, interactions, what have you, that lead to an individual person putting their thumbs in their ears, sticking out their tongue, and going because they may not want to reproduce. They may not want to not die at this moment, but you got to do something. But why? And that's the hard question, and hopefully I can offer one to you before this video ends. But really, I just wanted to offer one little last quote. There's a panel here at the very bottom. Go ahead and pause your screen for a moment. Okay, you got it? All right. Personally, I think we all have something to say to the world. The real question is, will anyone listen? And unfortunately, there's no way to know in advance. Again, the real purpose and function of this chapter in the book, and this is where I think it gets really, really, really meta, is to just ask the reader to stop and consider, can comics be on the same level as more traditional forms of artistic media? To which case, he offers, and I would argue as well, Yes, that isn't even a question anymore. It just is. Nevertheless, as my good buddy Socrates here once so beautifully said, the unexamined life is not really worth living. And so when one approaches the creation of art, it's important to understand, why am I doing this? Okay, story time. That's probably not going to stay. Probably not. Who knows? It'll fall down right in the middle of an emotional moment. But why am I doing this? As I've noted in a couple previous videos, I've just gotten out of a divorce. It was a bad marriage, it was emotionally abusive, and it's left me really demoralized. But before the divorce happened, I actually did several videos like this for a video or a YouTube channel called Catalyst University. It's run and operated by one of my friends, Kevin Tokoff. He's an amazing guy. Most of the videos on there are about biochemistry, calculus, physics, what have you, but he was trying to sort of diversify the portfolio, and so he offered me the chance to do a couple videos. I did a couple videos, and some of them now have upwards of about 4,000 views. That's pretty cool. Like, holy crap. Really? 4,000? There's 4,000 people who thought, hey, I want to listen to this guy talk ad nauseum for like half an hour and use the phrase ad nauseum far too many times. You're right, I need to stop that. But I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed doing it. And one of the hard things was I never really got much in the way of validation from my partner. And that hurt, because whenever I would show them my art or my comics, I wouldn't get much validation there either. To the point that a whole host of other factors that I'm not really going to get into basically amounted to me spending 8 years in a relationship where I was seemingly almost never validated, never encouraged, and my self-worth was practically down to nothing. And that's frustrating because I recognize these are probably not going to amount to much. Again, whenever I post them, I get like 3 or 4 views, if that. So the odds of me making money off of this are next to nil. Also, YouTube's ad revenue generator, you have to have like 1,000 views before you can monetize, and even then, it's not the same amount of money that it was like 5, 6, or even 10 years ago, so there's an issue as well. And so I think about my creative endeavors. Why am I doing this? I make comics. Is anybody going to pay me for those comics? Probably not. Realistically, probably not. Is anybody ever going to pay me to make these videos? I mean, I could start a Patreon, but I seriously doubt anybody would be interested. So why bother doing it? Because I want to? I mean, that's the thing, and that's something I've really trying to become more aware of with these videos, especially as I work through this beautiful, wonderful book, which is that I truly love comics. It's just one of my favorite mediums out there because, as I'm so fond of saying, you can do anything in a comic book. And there's so many different types of weird, strange, wonderful comics out there. And there's so many different opportunities for self-expression, either in the way that artists arrange the panels on the page, or even just in the strange and beautiful stories that they tell. Comics is fun, and it's really enjoyable to just sit here and nerd out and not have to worry about any sort of external validation, which I recognize is kind of like cognitive dissonance, because in order to get any kind of validation, you have to watch it. So maybe there is some egomaniacal level on this. But I hold that my creative goal with these is not simply to just, wave my arms about in front of a camera and go, hey, look at me, because nobody's looking. It's to bring awareness and attention and hopefully inspire some level of thought about the medium, and not just be one more person sitting here in front of a camera just talking endlessly and saying, you should read this book. There's far too many voices out there already saying that. The bigger question, and something I've been saying over and over again, is why should I read this book? Well, if we can just go full meta here, this book offers us the opportunity for metacognition. We are able to think about the way we think about the medium of comics, about the construction of comics, about the elements of comics, about the narrative structures of comics, about the art of comics. In the next chapter, we're going to be talking about color in comics, which is going to be really fun and really cool, and I'm really excited about it. But there's so many opportunities to really stop and reflect and to try to understand why artists go about doing this. Because again, art is simply self-expression, taking the opportunity to sit down with your thoughts, with your feelings, with your ideas, and make something. And yes, there are always going to be high art versus low art examples. But there again, media consumption, art consumption, it all comes down to personal taste. You need to read Understanding Comics because it's a wonderful book, and hopefully you're watching because, you like comics. And then maybe the reason you're watching is because you like me? Okay, that's a stretch. But the point is, I have no point. And I think that's actually probably a wonderful place to stop. All right, thank you for watching this video. I tremendously appreciate it. Thank you for listening to me sort of yammer on. I know this video was not sort of like as coherent as the previous ones have been about this book, but Chapter 7 is just so meta and out there, so it's really kind of difficult to translate in any way, and also it was an opportunity to just kind of vent a little bit, I guess. But whatever the case, we've only got about, I think, 2 more chapters left, so there's not going to be many more videos about understanding comics. Nevertheless, just keep your eyes tuned to the channel. As soon as we get some more, I'll update you. In the description section below, as always, I'll post a link to Scott McCloud's website as well as his TED Talk because they're just fantastic. And don't forget, if you're interested in understanding comics, hit up your local comic book shop. They could use the money. They could use the support. If they don't have a copy of it, they could probably order it for you. And if they don't have it, check out your local public library because, again, more and more libraries are recognizing what we recognize, which is that comics kick ass and they're worth your time. And again, if they don't have the book, you can always ILL it. Thank you again. As always, I'm so fond of saying that. Please like, share, and subscribe, not just because it'll validate me and make me feel special, but also just because it'll remind me or let me know that, hey, somebody somewhere is watching this. So it's an opportunity to keep making these. Then again, do I really need external validation in order to make things? Didn't I just spend a half hour talking about that? We'll get back to that. Whatever the case, please also feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Tell me what comics you're reading, what you'd like to see me read or talk about, because, again, I like comics. I'll read anything. The next couple of videos are going to be really interesting because we're going to be moving into some indie comics, and one that's particularly controversial, which I'm also super excited about that as well. I think I got all my bases covered. So with that, one more time, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.